Welcome to San Joaquin College of Law's 5th annual Constitution Day celebration. Wait a minute. This is a constitutional seminar. We're not talking about grades.
Grades equal genocide! Grades equal genocide! Grades equal genocide!
Wait a second. I recognize some of you. Most of you are alumni.
That's a lie!
No. Except for one person, you're all alumni. You can't be concerned with grades. Why?
We were invited to the celebration, so we got angry. Yeah, angry.
Yeah, but you were invited. Gwen sent out an email to all alumni inviting them to come. So why don't you join us and take part in the celebration?
So it wasn't a lie?
All right, well, sure, have a seat then. Ladies and gentlemen, the Not Ready for Clovis players. Mr. Gary Brunswick, alumni. Mr. Bob Abrams, Craig Tristo, my lovely wife Susan, and current student Dan Epperly. Big round of applause. Really welcome to San Joaquin College of Law's 5th annual Constitution Day celebration. I always like to acknowledge and explain why, although San Joaquin College of Law has been graduating outstanding lawyers for more than 30 years, we've only been celebrating the Constitution for 5 years. That's because the federal mandate that requires we do this so that you have access to federally guaranteed loans was only instituted 5 years ago. Previous Constitution Day presentations have focused on the structure of the constitutional system, constitutional interpretation, and an examination of how successfully government power has been kept in check by constitutional safeguards. Today, I'd like to do something a little different. I'd like to go really theoretical. And in case you're worrying that your eyeballs will glaze over, I have videos. For the first time ever, it is a multimedia presentation. All scholars agree that the value of freedom of speech, the reason that that's a fundamental right enshrined in the Constitution, is so that the people can discuss political matters, talk about who to vote for, what public policies should be supported or opposed. Now, that's not the only value of freedom of speech, but it is a universally agreed upon value. And usually my focus is on how well are the courts preventing the government from controlling our speech or silencing us. But I was inspired by the recent town halls being held on the healthcare issue to take a slightly different focus this time. As indicated by the topic is designed, I'm sure you realize, to lure you in and to titillate you enough so that you'll show up. And I always worry that it promises a little more excitement than the actual presentation will deliver. But we're not here to talk about healthcare except as ancillary to the main question, which is, since the Constitution doesn't apply to individuals, it is directed at governments with maybe one rare exception. We don't have to obey the Constitution. Then what is the appropriate role of a citizen in a constitutional democracy? That's the topic of my speech. I'm going to begin to talk about that by talking about the framers and why they wrote the Constitution the way they did. And much of this material, or all of this material, in fact, is based upon a book called Red, White, and Blue by Professor Mark Tushnet. So he gets the credit for the good part, and if I screw it up, that's just me. Two general theories informed the framing of the Constitution. One, the liberal tradition, emphasized the individualism of people acting in society and examined how social institutions rest on and constrain individual preferences. The civic republican tradition emphasized the essential social nature of individual being and examined how individual preferences rest on and constrain social institutions. These were not coherent, structured theories of politics or government systematically studied or advanced by scholars. They were belief systems that provided general frameworks for orienting thought about political life. The liberal tradition stressed the self-interested motives of individuals. It treated the collective good as the aggregation of what individuals choose. It insisted that public institutions be neutral towards competing conceptions of the good. And it emphasized the risks of governmental overreaching. It was historically associated with the view that the natural operations of a market economy produce sufficient liberty and equality to necessitate only relatively modest public adjustments. So you can see just from that list, it's the old word liberal, not the epithet that it's come to be in our politics today. It supported market-based theories, even though it was called liberal. The liberal tradition tended to be more alert to threats posed to liberty by government than to those posed by private centers of power. And it tended to design institutions that separated law and politics. The civic republican tradition was based on the notion that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It saw public institutions as important means by which private character is shaped. It was less suspicious of government, and it was more communitarian and therefore more exclusionary. And it was less concerned than the liberal tradition of designing institutions to separate law and politics. The liberal institution, because it focused on the individual self-interest as a motivator for human action, understood that a government had to be strong enough to protect property and promote growth, but that such a government might be too strong. And this is a theme I've harped upon many times. People who occupy positions of power in government, having disarmed the citizenry to protect them from each other, which is, of course, a debate we have today, may also be possessive individualists who will then use government power to obtain property for themselves. The framers believed that they could avoid this result by diffusing power, the power of government. And thus they adopted the system that we call federalism. It diffuses power vertically by granting only specific enumerated powers to the national government. It diffuses powers horizontally by retaining the 50 state governments, so that citizens are allowed to avoid localized oppression and secure the services they desire by voting with their feet, moving elsewhere. Thus, the framers believed that neither the central government or local governments would become too powerful. An additional check on national power was that the national government was structured so that it required the concurrence of many representatives with substantial local constituencies. Those would be our congresspeople, and that their action was required for government action. It tended to be, It diffused powers in another way by imposing external limitations on the power of government, exemplified by the Bill of Rights. The courts would then review legislation to determine whether it exceeded those limitations and was otherwise within the powers granted by the Constitution to the national government. Power diffusion mechanisms of this type threaten problems. The diffusion of power threatens paralysis of government, which is like having no government at all. And of course, here in California, we don't know what that's like because our state government is always so efficiently run that it gets things done ahead of schedule. Judicial review was an unstable solution because the framers had no reason to think that the judges would be any less possessive individualists than the representatives that the judges were intended to restrain. So Professor Tushnet said that three problems with the liberal tradition was legislative tyranny, paralysis, and if you try to solve legislative tyranny by giving the judges the power of judicial review, then you get judicial tyranny. The framers looked to the civic republican tradition to solve these problems. The Republican tradition expected that citizens would develop appropriately civic-minded characters. As I said, it believed that properly designed institutions could instill civic virtue in citizens. Alterations in the institutional design could constrain corruption directly by limiting opportunities in which self-interest could overcome civic-mindedness, and indirectly by reinforcing the citizenry's dedication to the public interest. And the way it expected that to happen was by making sure that all the citizens were relatively equal in terms of their property holdings, so that no private citizen could dominate other private citizens. The Republican tradition also saw a benefit in federalism, the retention of state governments alongside the national government. They believed that this would ensure that the most important activities of public life would take place in small units of government, making it easier for citizens to participate. So local and state governments would be something of a forming ground for national leaders. Citizens would draw broad lessons from their experience in local government. Small-scale dialogues would lead the citizens to understand that each of them has to subordinate self-interest if public business is to be accomplished. Government paralysis at the local level would inflict great pain on the citizenry, and it would be evident that cooperative efforts were required to avoid paralysis at that level. Thus, participation in local government would be an especially desirable form of civic education. Another benefit of federalism is that the citizens would watch each other as they go about the public business locally and learn which of them had the best character to serve as a delegate for the next larger unit of government. It's pretty much how we do it, isn't it? Don't you smirk at me. The general diffusion of power would limit opportunities for corruption, just as it limits the opportunities for individualist overreaching in the liberal tradition scheme. In the Republican tradition, federalism would not be paralyzed by a diffusion of power because the delegates to the national government would be chosen precisely because they would be unlikely to be subject to corruption and would be skilled at the public-spirited decision-making that they had performed at the local levels. The Republican tradition believed that it could avoid judicial tyranny because courts are relatively weak, and therefore the threat of corruption by judges is small. And this should get a hearty laugh from everyone who's ever had constitutional law, especially from me. The Republican tradition believed that the prescriptions of the Constitution were so clear and so well understood that they wouldn't give the judges any opportunity for misbehaving or corruption. Legislative tyranny would be avoided because the judges would enforce the terms of a readily understood Constitution. Giving the judges life tenure, as was done with federal judges, was a form of property interest which would ensure that they need not engage in corruption and could be independent. As I indicated, the Republican tradition assumed that leaders would arise from local constituencies whose members would become familiar with their capacities by experiencing leadership in local government. These representatives would remain familiar with their constituencies, drawing insights and knowledge about social problems and their solutions from those contacts. The Republican tradition thus believed that corruption would be restrained by non-institutional means. It stressed the importance of civic education so that the citizenry would be alert to corruption and active in fighting it. Since civic education doesn't work on all persons, coupled with a deference to social leaders, the Republican tradition did not envision universal suffrage. The population would be divided into citizens and others not expected to participate in politics, and the culture of deference would operate on those non-citizens to dampen their urges towards disorder. And if that sounds vaguely totalitarian, you might consider how the Constitution was written. The only white males with property were citizens. Africans were property of the white males. Women were not considered citizens, and maybe there weren't enough people of color around to oppress. So the franchise was limited to a very small group. The U.S. Senate, the senators were originally selected by state legislatures. They were not selected by popular vote, so that they could keep check on the Democratic mob represented by the House of Representatives, elected by the rich white guys who had the right to vote. So it was a blending of those traditions that resulted in the Constitution that we know. History tells us what happened to a constitution drafted to govern a society composed of a relatively small number of similarly educated, reasonably well-off white male citizens, the victors in a genocidal war of invasion against the Aboriginal peoples who lorded it over their African slaves and white females. Mobility in the citizenry, a virtue in the Republican tradition, has so increased that fewer and fewer of us have any roots in a particular community. The scale of local government has grown such that only the most avid followers of politics have any contact with it. Political experience at a local level is no longer the most obvious route to national political office. Other forms of celebrity, such as media, athletics, or military rank, provide fame which leads to national office. That's really true. You could get elected governor of a state just because you were an actor. I mean, it's hard to believe, but I could prove that if you want to see me after the presentation. The distinction between citizens and others have been significantly eroded, which some of us celebrate. The right to vote has formally, at least, been extended to all adults. The culture of deference that the Republican tradition expected to maintain order, even among those not committed to the constitutional order, has been abandoned. Judicial appointments have become politically sensitive, and the idea that the Constitution has a plain meaning has become implausible, to say the least. Earlier I posed the question, what role did the framers envision for individuals in a constitutional democracy? I think the liberal tradition saw this as individuals would pursue their private interests, defined by whatever conception of the good they held, within the framework of political institutions designed to minimize the danger that any one group could monopolize government power. In the aggregate, the rational pursuit of self-interest, appropriately channeled by these political institutions, would promote the good of all. The Republican tradition saw that individuals would participate in local politics via political institutions designed to promote the citizens' commitment to good government, thereby identifying and selecting public-spirited leaders who would rise to office in the national government, where they would continue to make decisions based on the public good rather than their own personal self-interest. Under either tradition, citizens were expected to be reasonably well educated, to be sufficiently independent so that they would not be controlled by more powerful individuals, and to make decisions about public policies based on informed reason. Let's see how that worked out. Lights, please. Which brings me to my next topic. I'm going to read from a publication called The Policy Speak Disaster for Healthcare, recently written by George Lakoff, the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Distinguished Professor of Cognitive Science and Linguistics at the University of California at Berkeley. And this material was brought to my attention by Mr. Steve Malm, with whom I often have fascinating conversations about topics like this. And so now I'm speaking with Mr. Lakoff's material. Policy speak is the principle that if you just tell people the policy facts, they will reason to the right conclusion and support the policy wholeheartedly. Policy speak presumes a rational public discussion. Convince the populace rationally on the objective policy merits. Give the facts and figures. Assume self-interest as the motivator of rational choice. Convince people by the logic of the policymakers that the policy is in their interest. To a cognitive scientist or neuroscientist, this view of human reason and language is simply false. Policy speak is supposed to be a reasoned, objective discourse. It assumes a theory of what reason itself is, a philosophical theory that dates back to the 17th century and is still taught. Cognitive science and neuroscience have provided a scientific view of how the brain and mind really work. The old philosophical theory says that reason is conscious, can fit the world directly, is universal, is dispassionate, is literal, works by logic, is abstract, and functions to serve our interests. The scientific research in neuroscience and cognitive science has shown that most reason is unconscious. Since we think with our brains, reason cannot directly fit the world. Emotion is necessary for rational thought. If you cannot feel emotion, you will not know what to want or how anyone else would react to your actions. Rational decisions depend on emotions. Empathy with others has a physical basis, and as much as self-interest, empathy lies behind reason. Ideas are physical, part of brain circuitry. Ideas are constituted by brain structures called frames and metaphors, and reason uses them. Frames form systems called worldviews. All language is defined relative to such frames and metaphors. There are very different conservative and progressive worldviews, and different words can activate different worldviews. Important words like freedom can have entirely different meanings depending upon your worldview. As a result, what is taken as objective discourse is often worldview dependent, and the foundational assumptions underlying policy speak are false. Words activate frame and metaphor circuits, which in turn activate worldview circuits. Whenever brain circuitry is activated and synapses get stronger, the circuits are easier to activate again. Now it's Professor Lakoff speaking very directly. And he, like me, he is, I think, a leftist. Conservative tacticians may not know about brain research, but they know about marketing, and marketing theorists use that brain research. This is why conservatives place such importance on language choice. From the classic socialized medicine to Luntz's government takeover to Palin's death panels. When repeated over and over, the words evoke a conservative worldview. With many of the specific boogeymen, abortion, socialism equals communism equals Nazism, euthanasia, foreigners, taxes, spending, the liberal elite, and so on. The most effective language has emotional appeal, and to conservatives, a moral appeal, because it activates the conservative moral worldview. And such language, repeated every day, changes brains, strengthening the synapses of those who listen. Conservative language will activate and strengthen conservative worldviews, even when negated. The classic example is Richard Nixon's "I am not a crook," which made everyone think of him as a crook. Well, I mean, I think that's a slight exaggeration, but... And yet, I've heard President Obama say, "We don't want a government takeover," which activates the idea of a government takeover. MediaMatters.org has written, "The media have debunked the death panels more than 40 times. It then gives a list of 40 cases of debunking, each one of which uses the term death panels. And you wonder, after so many debunkings, why it is still believed. Each debunking reinforced the idea. The first rule of effective communication is stating the positive in your own terms, not quoting the other side's language with a negation." Why have highly educated progressives who argue for the importance of science, why have they been ignoring or rejecting the science of brain of mind? A great many progressives have not grown up with, nor have they learned, the new scientific understanding of reason. Instead, they have acquired the old philosophy of reason and assume it every day in everything they do. The old view is inscribed indelibly on the synapses of their tottering, aged brains. Actually, I ad-libbed there. It will be hard for these progressives to comprehend the new science that contradicts their daily practice. They may find it hard to comprehend framing, metaphor, and narrative as the way reason really works, as what you need to communicate truth. Instead, they may well think of framing as merely manipulation and spin, as the mechanism that the right wing uses to communicate lies. And I have to say that when Mr. Malma and I were first talking about this, that's exactly what I said to him. So Mr. Lakoff is obviously a very perceptive scientist. Okay, let's dim the lights and take a look at what may be an example of policy speak, and you can consider Lakoff while a clown from Saturday Night Live talks to you. Views on healthcare. Please raise your hands. Well, I thought it'd be interesting to have kind of an example of policy speak. The actual video was supposed to be the proper way to respond to an angry crowd of Republicans. If the traditional model of human cognition is accurate, then citizens should feel a patriotic obligation not only to engage in reasoned debate of public issues, but to permit other voices to be heard. The purpose of public meetings is to obtain information, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of proposed policies, and communicate individual preferences to government officials. Just saying that makes me feel ridiculous. Even before the health care town halls, that wasn't how public meetings went. That isn't how political campaigns have been conducted, in my memory. If Professor Lakoff is correct about how humans reason, and I hope you heard the air quotes in that, then citizen participation in a constitutional democracy seems to involve receipt of carefully crafted frames and metaphors, whose purpose is to activate synapses to strengthen or weaken particular worldviews. Aside from the experts or gifted leaders who construct the frames and metaphors, the individual is acted upon or simply repeats the frames to other individuals. Maybe there are more than 2 or more kinds of people, and political communication should be tailored to the method of reasoning used by each. The traditional liberal approach is to try to make sure that each citizen is well educated, understands and is committed to civic responsibility, and has a personal stake in maintaining the constitutional system. Thus, universal free public education and a public policy commitment to ensuring that all have a decent standard of living. As far as I, a liberal, can tell, the conservative political approach rejects, often vehemently, all of those ideas. The marketplace of ideas takes on a new meaning when the marketing principles advocated by Professor Lakoff are utilized. What do you think? Let's talk about it. And that's my presentation. Now is the public participation portion of the Constitution Day celebration. And I don't know whether you want to tape that or not, but if you do, stick a mic in their face. Sir.
When the Supreme Court rules on the Hillary Clinton booty case, they will presumably make in their decision the Supreme Court reporters voluntary inclusion that obviously corporations are persons from the 1888 Santa Clara Railroad case. When the Supreme Court reaches that and says, yes, corporations are persons entitled to free speech, do you think the Supreme Court would recognize that there's a compelling and necessary governmental interest in regulating the amount of money corporations or individuals can spend on campaigns to influence the outcome of elections?
Well, that's very difficult to answer because the trajectory of the Supreme Court in regulating campaign finance, which began with Buckley versus Vallejo, and clearly applied strict scrutiny because political speech is of the highest constitutional value. And then the next major case that they undertook, McConnell, something, help me out here, Professor Manning Cartwright. Yeah, FEC versus McConnell. They said, nope, we didn't apply strict scrutiny after all. You're all wrong. When we were talking about needing a compelling interest and the least restrictive means, we weren't applying strict scrutiny. So, and please excise this from the presentation in after production. I refer to the Supreme Court with the greatest and deepest respect when I'm discussing them in class as evil, insane clowns, because I can't understand how they can produce the decisions that they produce unless that's what they are. So I'm terrified, and this is straying a little bit from the citizen participation subject, that consciously or otherwise, a significant number of Supreme Court justices reach the outcome first and then work backward to a justification. And when you do that, it destroys any coherent system of constitutional jurisprudence. So a prediction is kind of ridiculous in that context. Okay, well, we'll take up our betting later. So what should we do about the town halls? Are they a good thing? Is everything working out? Is Glenn Beck, in fact, the equivalent on the right side of Al Franken on the left side, which I read today in my various readings? Al Franken, Glenn Beck, they're both entertainers who talk about politics. Does anybody know who Glenn Beck is? Yeah. Oh, I've got some more videos. Was there a hand? Jeff?
So does Lakoff have some suggestions about what the left should do in the way of producing?
Very specific ones.
Is there a Lakoff version of Fox News?
Well, I think he would clearly agree that that's exactly what should be done. That the task of the left, of progressives, is to develop frames and metaphors that operate on the synapses in the opposite direction of those crafted by the right. So he says we shouldn't call it a public option. That's bad for the synapses. We call it the American plan. And if you know, his paper is on truthout.org, and it was published August 20th. So you can probably find it. But he has much more specific prescriptions. We should vilify the insurance companies. There are already death panels, and those are the insurance companies that deny everyone coverage. So reframe the issue to get the right synapses is the way I would say it. Now, in fairness, let's let someone else. And it's appropriate, right? And again, you can tell that I'm the old geezer who, can't appreciate Lakoff maybe well enough, because it seems to me that he is acknowledging that the truth will not win out, which is a fundamental old person's view of freedom of speech. The reason we don't give the government the authority to punish falsehood is that the government will use it to oppress us. And the remedy for falsehood is truth. Part of what Lakoff does is go through a couple of attempts to persuade people to support health care, which he terms policy speak. And he vilifies them. And he says, who's going to pay attention to 24 reasons why you should be in favor of health care? We need frames and metaphors. Now, if they're true frames and metaphors, then okay. But if false frames and metaphors are just as effective on human beings as the true ones, then the marketplace of ideas is a joke and a fraud. And the more power that individual collections of wealth, which includes unions, I'm playing to my right-wing pals, then the more power we give over those concentrations of wealth over us. And the corporations have most of the money.
Part of the problem with the free speech in the town hall is a lot of it is coached or decided by people like Glenn Beck and so forth in the media. And if you end up with, if the media has the right to free speech, where do you draw the line as to, is that commercial speech, is it free speech? It's the people with the money that are controlling that.
Well, it's fairly well established in constitutional jurisprudence that the fact that you pay for somebody to do the speech doesn't make it commercial speech. That's not what commercial speech means. Those are real problems in the sense that, as I was just saying, you can buy speech with money, and if you have a lot of money, you can buy more speech and reach more people. The problem is, what is the prescription for that? Is the cure worse than the disease? I'm struggling to find a non-outmoded phrase, and I can't come up with any. We'll stop those evil corporations from spending their money on tricking people with shills and stuff like that, and then people will put Acorn out of business because they're just a bunch of people doing the same thing. The unions won't be able to engage in advocacy. Nonprofits won't be able to engage in advocacy. So it's kind of like the jury system. It's terrible, it's awful, it's riddled with bias and inexactitude, and yet there is no better alternative. And so I wonder, is it a better alternative to give up, and I'm speaking as an old person, is it better to give up on civic education and give up on public-spirited action and just try and market your stuff the best way you can? Market the truth the best way you can, instead of the outmoded notion that the truth will ultimately persuade. Maybe, that could be just false.
Can you tweak that to 147 characters or less?
As many of you know, are already my tweeterers, my tweet followers. I don't tweet, no, I'm sorry. I want to tweet, but I have to master PowerPoint first.
Would a return to the fairness doctrine of equal time assuming that can be brought back?
It can't. There's no support for it whatsoever in the Congress that I'm aware of. But that is an effectuation of the notion that government has some obligation to not only not suppress speech, but to facilitate speech, to do something to make sure that all voices have an opportunity to be heard, like must-carry channels on cable TV and public access channels. And those things are very controversial. I think they're extremely not wanted by the conservative political viewpoint. And so I personally think that would be a good idea, but I don't think it could possibly happen. Anyone today who says, okay, I've got a solution to our problems, I'm going to raise taxes, that's the end of their political career. It's over. Anyone, any party. So we're going to have government spend money making speech available to the citizenry. That would be great. It's not going to happen in my view. I am a pessimist, however. So don't take that as gospel. And that's no lie. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming.